Those of us living with MS, we ask repeatedly, why is it taking so long to find the cause, let alone to find the cure? Well, I saw a study today that doesn't necessarily get at that at all, but it helps me explain maybe a little bit of why it's taking such a long time. Hello and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam. I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 39 years, and I keep looking at all the research that's coming out because I want to extract the hope and the reality from the hype and the doom and gloom that often accompanies much of what I read about multiple sclerosis. And I have something for you today that I think maybe will, I don't know, maybe it won't make you any happier necessarily, but at least it might help explain why it's taking so darn long. After all, we've cured other diseases. We got eradicated smallpox in the day. We've done a lot with medicines, with surgeries, with vaccines to help other conditions, but MS still eludes everyone. They're doing their best, but it doesn't seem like we found the actual breakthrough. So let's think about this for a minute, though, because why might that be? What's unique about MS that makes it difficult for the scientists and the researchers to find the cause of MS and what might cure it? I'm just going to jump in here for a minute. If you've watched this the day I posted or shortly thereafter, you're probably wondering why I'm wearing a turtleneck and a vest in the middle of August. And I assure you, it's not because my house is kept at frigid temperatures. It's because I actually made that video in February of 2024. And I did not post it. Part of the reason for that was because I kept getting news articles that I thought were relevant and time sensitive, and I really wanted you to know those things. And this video, while I hope the information is useful, is not time sensitive, so it kind of just kept getting bumped and bumped and bumped. And so that's why you see me wearing seasonally inappropriate clothing. But be that as it may, the other reason that I wasn't posting it was because I kept feeling like there was something missing, something I needed to add. And just today, I watched a new video from Dr. Boster about curing MS, and I thought, well, this is it. This is what we're missing, because he lays out 3 basic areas that he thinks need to be addressed in order to cure MS. In the beginning of the video, he talks about preventing MS, and he focuses on the Epstein-Barr virus. If we had an injection for that, he said, you never know, that might actually prevent MS. And he assures us that such a vaccine is indeed in the works. But then the rest of the video, he gives you the 3 areas that he thinks need to be focused on in order to cure MS for those of us who already have it. So I thought that would be useful as a way to preface the rest of my comment.
A different hypothetical approach to curing MS would be treatments for someone who already has the condition. And I would submit to you that we would need 3 kinds of medications to cure the disease. Today in 2024, we only have one of those 3. The first one we would need would be a neuroprotective agent, something to protect the nervous system from accelerated brain volume loss and from the inflammatory damage. Now, we have not been able to develop that yet, but there are many investigations targeting neuroprotection. The second treatment that we would want to have is something called remyelination, where you place the plastic back on the wire. You put the oligodendrocytes, the myelin, back on the axons. And again, that is works in progress. Today, as I make this video, we have not yet been successful doing that, but there are many international labs studying that exact question, and we remain very hopeful. The third thing that we would need to cure MS, we actually do have, and these are anti-inflammatory agents like the current disease-modifying therapies to prevent new inflammatory attacks causing lesions and causing attacks. Hypothetically, if we could bring all three of these types of therapies to bear, neuroprotection, remyelination, and anti-inflammation, we could hypothetically cure the disease.
And we know that in all three of those areas, a lot of work is being done. I've been reporting to you on some of the promising developments, actually, in some of those areas. But the jury's out and nothing's ready for prime time. So I'm just going to go back to the original video that I made and talk about the difference between the observational studies that we have relied on a lot to tell us what directions might be promising, and the interventional studies, which, while they are very useful, also are very time-consuming. Well, here's an article that I just saw, and it has to do with brain trauma possibly being causative of MS. And I am not going to read this article to you, though I will link it down below. And I'll also link the Google search that I did to see if this was just a unique outlier kind of thing or whether there had been research done on it before. And here's what I found on that page. Let's take a minute and look at that. Okay, so as you see, I went out to Google and I searched head trauma plus multiple sclerosis. And I found a lot of stuff. Again, we're not going to click on it, but I just want to give you an idea of all the things that I found. And this top one is from WebMD, and they say a few recent studies have shown that people who had concussions as teenagers are up to twice as likely to be diagnosed with MS years later. The more head injuries kids had, the more likely they were to get MS later in life. Yeah, so that's an observational study, basically. We're not going to go around giving kids head trauma just so we can tell whether they're going to get MS. So the data is probably not 100% available either, right? I mean, we know that people get concussions, they don't report them, etc., etc. So who knows? Who knows really what to make of this? But if I were a parent, I'd be a little concerned about my kid playing contact sports. And that's kind of how some of these tend to read, I'm afraid. They're a little bit sensational. But let's scroll down a little bit. I'm just going to look at some of these. The other thing that's interesting to see here are some of the dates. Like here's one from 2006, risk of multiple sclerosis after head injury, linkage, etc., etc. It says that the possibility of head injury may influence the development of multiple sclerosis. But the word may is important because, of course, it may not. And here's one from 2017. Researchers may have discovered a cause of multiple sclerosis. You'll notice that word may is going to come up a lot. And then we have one here. Then we have one here from the National Institutes of Health, a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis following whiplash injury from 2021. And then my MS team, head trauma and multiple sclerosis. And then JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, trauma and multiple sclerosis, demyelinating disorders. And it says that trauma can cause a local disruption of the blood-brain barrier and serve as a blah, blah, blah. But, you know, once again, it's a can or a may. The statistics seem to show that, but it's not definite. It's not been proven. And then we just keep going down here. We can see head trauma results in manifold increased risk of multiple sclerosis. That's from 2024, so that's a very current one. And then Nature has one, concussion during adolescence linked to increased risk of multiple sclerosis, and that was from 2017. And it's noteworthy that this one finds no connection between concussion and a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis later on. Yeah, we can just keep going on through here. See, here's 2018, 2017, and there's one from 2024, 2014, 2024, 2017. So as you can see, and the reason that I'm going through all of this is just so that you get the idea this is not a new idea, and data just continues to be collected about it. But we don't know. I mean, there's no definitive linkage yet. And with observational studies, you really kind of can't do that. It takes many, many years before you could definitively say that you have found the causal link for multiple sclerosis. And then, of course, what about those of us who never had a traumatic brain injury and we have MS anyway? The counter hypothesis, I have no idea. That's what I'm really trying to get at, is that it is extremely painstaking and time-consuming to develop these scenarios where some particular thing is a causal factor, not may be a causal factor, but is a causal factor. And quite frankly, we are not there yet. Okay, so it doesn't even look all that definitive just as we look at all these different studies and what they focused on and what they concluded, does it? Here's something that I think is even more important. Over the course of my lifetime, there have been a number of hypotheses about what causes MS. Perhaps it's caused by exposure to canine distemper before you reach puberty. Perhaps it results from an exposure to the polio virus in childhood, whether you actually get polio or not. If you're just exposed to the virus, if you're playing, for example, near an old cemetery where polio victims are buried, you might get MS from that. There's the hypothesis that you live in a part of the world that doesn't get enough sunlight, sun exposure, vitamin D, whatever. There's the hypothesis that your diet is too rich in saturated fat because you live in the culture that's more of the beer butter culture than the wine olive oil culture. And then there's the more current hypothesis that MS is caused by exposure to the Epstein-Barr virus. And certainly that's been all over the news lately. But, let's step back a minute. What do all these hypotheses have in common? Well, they are observational rather than interventional. And let's talk about that because that's pretty important. In research, there are two ways of collecting data to figure out if something is related to something else. One of them is an observational study where you basically just look at all the data that's already been published or that's already available, and you draw conclusions from it. It doesn't necessarily involve having any participants in any kind of a clinical trial or a study or anything, although you can do that. But once again, all you're doing is you're collecting data. You're not trying to change anything about that person's life. You're just checking all of the parameters that might have been an influence on why they ended up with MS. The other way to go about it is what they call an interventional trial, where you have a control group who just goes on life as they've always been, and the experimental group who takes the drug or does the exercise or changes the behavior or gets out in the sun more, whatever. And that you compare the results of the two groups and you see if you can draw any conclusions. But as you can see from this list that I just put up a few minutes ago, all of these hypotheses about what causes MS, they are observational, not experimental. And there's a reason for that, right? I mean, think about it. Is it ethical to have an experiment, let's say on this head trauma one that's just come out, to cause someone to have head trauma and see if they get MS, compared to someone else that you don't give head trauma to see if they get MS? And of course, with MS, you have to wait a while. So it's going to be 20, 30 years maybe before they develop MS, even if head trauma does cause MS. So what we're saying here is that it's necessary for these studies to be observational only because it would be unethical as well as impractical to make them experimental. You can't do certain things to people to see if MS is going to be the result of it. That just would not be nice at all. And I'll tell you one thing, that would not be an experiment I would volunteer for, and I'm sure most other people wouldn't either. I don't know if that helps at all to explain why it is so difficult to find the cause of multiple sclerosis, but I hope it does. I hope that you see that It isn't just a simple matter of just playing around with different chemicals, different drugs, different behavior interventions until we finally hit the recipe that works. With any science, hypothesis does not turn into proven fact until a lot of data has been collected and the experiment has been replicated many, many times. And then time has to go by. Because time is also, especially with something like MS, time is an important variable and has to be dealt with. It's so difficult, especially with progressive forms of MS. It's so difficult to establish any kind of a reasonable time frame during which or after which or by which some particular thing was supposed to happen. So there you are. I'm not trying to say that we don't have hope yet and there's no breakthrough on the horizon. I would never say that. I guess it's just for me, it's helpful to remember why it's taking so long. But I would be curious to know if that makes sense to you and if something like that has already kind of crossed your mind, because you've seen all these studies too, and perhaps you've developed a certain healthy skepticism about them, and I wouldn't blame you one bit for doing it. But now maybe you have a way to explain your skepticism that is a little more satisfying. Well, that's all I had for you today. So until I see you again in my next video, please take really good care of yourself.